Thank you very much, Afra, for the kind introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone tuning in virtually to the ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute's Regional Outlook Forum 2022. I have the honor and the pleasure to kick off the discussions for the forum's second day discussions, continuing with the country-focused analyses from yesterday. And we start off today's discussions with Myanmar. Now, a year ago, at the Regional Outlook Forum 2021, the outlook for Myanmar was one of measured optimism. The newly re-elected National League for Democracy, or NLD government, was planning recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic on both the health and economy fronts, but those plans and many of the aspirations for continuing Myanmar's democratic and economic transformation all crumbled when on the 1st of February 2021, the Myanmar military seized power. Since then, we have seen young people protesting loudly against the power grab that cancelled their futures. We have seen the military escalating excessive violence against protesters, killing thousands, detaining many thousands more. Military operations in various parts of the country have added to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, dashing all hopes for the projected early recovery to one that faces a negative double-digit forecast. And so as 2022 dawns, the future seems bleak indeed for Myanmar, with the only certainty seeming to be the continuation of uncertainties over livelihoods and survival, over voice expression and accountability, over the fate of many detainees, including Aung San Suu Kyi and senior leaders of the NLD government, and also over how ASEAN's efforts to mediate the Myanmar crisis will turn out. Two experts with years of research and personal experience on Myanmar's quest for change that all in the country could believe in, to misquote President Obama's 2008 election campaign slogan. These experts join me today to discuss what 2022 may hold for Myanmar and also some key dynamics to watch out for. Both these experts are well known to many who have followed Myanmar before and after the brief decade of opening and transition. I myself have learnt much and continue to learn from my interactions with both. Their full bios are on the Regional Outlook Forum website, so I shall be brief in introducing or reintroducing them to ISEAS audiences. For the political outlook for Myanmar, we shall have views and insights from Dr. Min Zin, the Executive Director of the Institute for Strategy and Policy, Myanmar. The ISP Myanmar is an independent and non-governmental think tank in Myanmar, and many of us who follow Myanmar are quite familiar with Dr. Min Zin's writings in various journals and newspapers on the developments in Myanmar. Giving the economic outlook, linking that to the overall strategic and political situation in the country, we will have Dr. Matthew Arnold, who is an academic and policy analyst focusing on politics and governance as well as peace and conflict. Dr. Arnold has served as the Asia Foundation's country representative in Myanmar and before that in assorted roles with the foundation in Yangon since 2012. Prior to his Myanmar stint, Dr. Arnold also conducted extensive academic research on conflict governance and state fragility and has in-depth knowledge of many countries around the globe, including Iraq, Timor-Leste, Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Thailand. Without further ado, I would now like to give the virtual floor to our first speaker to give us the political outlook. Over to you, Dr. Min Zin.
Thank you so much, Ms Moe, for your kind introduction, and also thank you for having me in this important forum. In my presentation, can we present the PowerPoint slide, please? In my presentation, I would like to draw your attention after the violent conflict of 2021, military coup, and then humanitarian catastrophe. I think we need to focus how to de-escalate the violent conflict in Myanmar so that the urgent needs of civilian protection and the humanitarian access will be achieved, and eventually the politics as a means of resolving conflict will be brought back in Myanmar. So can we move to next slide, please? I think since the military coup, both the coup makers and the resistance movement are still pursuing the unilateral strategies in the hope that they will win over each other. And then they are locking themselves into a position where a violent resolution is the only conceivable strategy in Myanmar right now. So as I said, politics as a peaceful means to transform the conflict in Myanmar has been abandoned for now. Next slide, please. And then we have now a new conflict map because of the military brutal crackdown and also the parallel government NUG call for defensive war against the junta. In September, the resistance movement largely shifted from violent to non-violent. And then various people defense forces and then local defense forces are gaining ground in several regions of the country, and they fought back against the military. And an insurrection broke out in many regions of the country, in two ethnic regions, especially the Chin and Karenni, which had maintained relative peace before the military coup, but now broke out, all-out insurrection, and also in the heartland of the Burma majority, ethnic Burma majority areas, such as Sagaing and Magwe. Now we have seen increasing insurrection with more sophistication. And as I said, a new conflict map with a set of new actors have emerged with the rapid rise of humanitarian causes, such as civilian death, displacement, and the destruction of infrastructures. So not only with the new actors, between new actors, PDF forces and the junta, but also the existing ethnic armed groups, EAOs, and fighting against the military has been intensified in last few months. Next slide, please. Now have a look at this conflict map. The map shows locations of townships where we have seen fightings more than at least one time. And you can see almost all regions of the country has suffered from the violent conflict. The conflict has intensified in less 4 months. Even though we can see in the next slides, that the numbers of armed clashes we have documented in our institute. In this map, you can see the red dot shows the armed clashes between the newly emerged actors, PDF, and the military. And then the blue dot indicate the clashes between ethnic armed groups and the junta. And then the few small, yellow is between the ethnic armed groups themselves, and especially in the Shan state. And next slide, please. In these slides, you will see the numbers of armed clashes and civilian casualties. Since February up to December 31st, we have documented more than 2,103 armed clashes happened in Myanmar. But the most intense clashes and fighting took place since September, and there are more than 1,000. So in terms of the highest number of clashes, the September marked the highest number, and the December last month was in terms of civilian death, which is the highest in last year. Next slide, please. These slides focus mainly on the conflict between PDF forces and the military. And then you can see the highest number of civilian death in December. We can recall what happened in Kayah State. At least 35 civilian, including 4 children, and also even save the children's staff, were killed and then banned by the military. So these numbers, and also the military in December, they use heavy the helicopters, as well as like other type of airstrikes in the central, upper Myanmar villages to crack down the PDF forces. These crackdown add up in terms of numbers for the civilian death too. Next slide, please. And then you can see this, the huge humanitarian cost. This chart explains the numbers of IDP, in addition to our like almost 1 million refugees and Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh and the Korean and Shan refugees in Thailand. Now we have like huge number of internally displaced people. What struck me a lot is in Kayah State population is about 280,000, like less than 300,000 people living in Kayah State. Now almost half of the population is being displaced because of the conflict. And you can see in Sagaing, which is in the Myanmar heartland, and then this is unprecedented, things taking place in Myanmar. Burma majority ethnic people start seeing they are being, uprooted from their houses. Their houses and their villages are being burned down. Next slide, please. This indicates that the Burmese military, the Myanmar military, is not able and not likely to gain ground control in near future in time to hold any meaningful political project such as their promised new election in 2023. Instead of that, the Burmese military, Myanmar military, continues to commit severe human rights violation with the mindless tyrannical brutality, and then that caused huge humanitarian catastrophe in the context of COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide, please. They lack not only tactical ground control because of the massive resistance movement, but also they lack political exit strategy, which is quite interesting because that deepening the military legitimacy, not only in the eyes of the general public, even in the eyes of their own close like proxies and their own close supporters, domestic as well as internationally. What happened was it's different from the 1962 military coup. In 62, General Ne Win took over power and articulated the Burmese way to socialism as an exit strategy. In 1988, the SLOC SPDC, they took over power. They incentivized the crony capitalism, at least to co-opt a certain group of the population in the country. And then eventually they came up with the 2008 constitution so that, at least this is at the time the only game in town. So right now for the current junta, they do not have any credible political exit strategy. That's a major legitimacy crisis for the military. Next slide, please. Now we can see two default scenario. One is baseline scenario. This is what military's roadmap, which promise of the election in 2023. Because of that lack of ground control and lack of credibility, is increasingly unlikely to happen. So then another default trend is, I would say, worst case scenario, which can be two-way. One is the military, because they cannot implement their own roadmap. They will find scapegoat among themselves, and then they will extend their rule by suspending the constitution. The second possibility is because of all these resistance and violence and economic crisis and humanitarian catastrophe, the country will see failure of state institution with decades of low intensity anarchy, lack of rule of law, as a reminder of what Furnival predicted, in the 20th centuries. After a period of anarchy, that this country will find as a province of China. That's also implicate the geopolitical importance. And next slide, please. Aside from this baseline and worst case scenarios, I think that there can be two other intervention pathway. The first intervention strategy, the pathway that we can probably see from now on, Mo, in 2022, 2023, at least next 1 or 2 years, is more revolutionary pathway. The population, because of the grievances, are very radicalized, and then they want to increase the destructive war against the military in the hope of achieving zero-sum regime change. So that's one pathway. The second pathway is more like conflict transformation, which still advocates, constructive, conflict, waging against the military, but with more combination of, like pressure and inducement, pressure and compromise. That's a second pathway. Next slide, please. Both pathways will face profound challenges. The revolutionary pathway will find itself in a prolonged and costly struggle because in the absence of like three factors, one is counter-coup or split within the military that favors the resistance movement, which is quite so far hard to imagine it will take place. Second is effective foreign intervention. That's also very unlikely. The third is unified ethnic armed groups fighting against the military. That's also a persistent myth in Myanmar politics. That's also very unlikely. For the conflict transformation advocates, they will find huge challenges too, because it's so hard to reframe this radical zero-sum game, perception into more like mediation and conflict resolution. And also it's so hard to figure out how to strengthen coordinated international mediation mechanism because we have like tens of, we have like varieties of different spatial envoys with the different interests vis-a-vis Myanmar. And then the last thing is also very difficult with this intensity and brutality of the repression. How do we defend and empower moderate civic and political spaces and actors inside the country? Next slide, please. These slides basically capture what I've discussed in terms of scenarios, like baseline scenario, worst case scenario, and possible intervention, theory of change, and all these challenges. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And then since November, we have noticed a turning point that could probably lead to a possible way out, even though it could be suboptimal, has emerged in Myanmar. Varieties of like key diplomats from the China, Japan, India, Thailand, even United States made a visit to Naypyidaw. And also even the Cambodia Prime Minister as the ASEAN chair has started his visit to Myanmar today. We have seen a lot of diplomatic traffic and discussion going on in Naypyidaw. One senior diplomat talked to me. He said, a consensus is no country in the region can afford a wait-and-see approach anymore. Myanmar must return to democracy, but it's a very important but, he said, not by all means, because further radicalization of the crisis will destroy the country's state institution and then create massive spillover effect to the regions. So we must, brainstorm and explore all possible entry points, that will address human rights violation, humanitarian access, and growing intensity of civil war. I mean, this somehow reflects ASEAN's 5-point consensus, but all attempts must aim for de-escalation of conflict violence so that the urgent needs of civilian protection and humanitarian access will be achieved. And eventually that will bring, these efforts will bring the politics as a means of resolving conflict back in Myanmar. But when we talk about strategy and entry point and turning point, I want to make it one caveat. As next slide, please, the last slide. As the Mike Tyson, somewhat once said, everybody has a plan until they got a punch in their mouth. So we all talk about all these things. There could be a lot of unpredictable and expected things can be coming out. So that I would urge, all of us to be more cautious in terms of chasing closure. I think in politics, especially in the Myanmar politics, it'll be always good to lower our urge and need for the closure. Thank you.
Right on time. And you've raised so many important points, food for thought there, highlighting the very binary positions that either the junta or the resistance to it have locked themselves into, and also the kind of profound challenges that either of the pathways that you have described, whether you go for the revolutionary pathway or the conflict transformation pathway, that it's not going to be overnight, and that the next 2 to 3 years also hold a lot more uncertainties on how, I think, the whole process of trying to bring politics back into Myanmar, as you have observed, and really trying to facilitate that return to democracy for Myanmar is still fraught with uncertainties, despite, I think, the goodwill and commitment of many. I will reserve the main discussion of your points to the question and answer session that we have allocated. To our audiences tuning in, do pose your questions, clicking the Q&A button on the far right of the screen that you have for the live stream. And while we are listening to the second speaker's insights, I think you can already start posing your questions. Do please state your name, your affiliation, and if you have a specific question for either of the two speakers, do please also indicate to whom you are addressing the question. Now, without further ado, the next 15 minutes is for Dr. Matthew Arnold to present your views and insights, sir, on the situation in Myanmar, as well as the economic outlook. Over to you, Matthew.
Good morning. It is my pleasure to speak today. Thank you to ISEAS for the invitation and to Ms Moe for the invitation. I will take the next 15 minutes or so to provide a strategic overview of the conflict in Myanmar and conclude with some thoughts on economic ramifications. First off, it is important to note that the analysis of my comments today is underpinned by a conflict incidence data set that I have compiled since the coup. It comprises over 6,600 incidents from the 1st of February to the present, but focus specifically on what I term conflict incidents from May onwards, when the nature of resistance shifted towards nationwide armed revolt. My main point is that armed resistance to military dictatorship has continued to expand in both scope and intensity, and will continue to do so. Since February, over 250 out of the country's 330 townships have experienced at least some conflict incidents. Key to armed resistance has been the increasing assertion and steady expansion of the PDFs, the People's Defense Forces, as well as steady military actions by major ethnic armed organizations, notably the KNU and the KIA. The National Unity Government's September 7 declaration calling for a national uprising was a major milestone in the country's history. The declaration did not significantly change the strategy and tactics used by the resistance. Rather, it signaled a distinct escalation in attacks utilizing available resources. The security firm Italian notes that 83% of all PDF attacks have taken place after that declaration. Resistance to military rule is now self-sustaining in terms of resourcing, safe havens, and personnel, and cannot be easily extinguished by the SAC. SAC forces have had no success forcing key ethnic armed organizations to sign ceasefires or to break their burgeoning relationships with the NUG and PDFs. Resistance forces now have established safe havens with both the KIA and KNU, amongst others, where they can safely train and equip fighters. This is despite major SAC attacks in places like south of Mewati last month. In response to increasing armed resistance, the SAC is implementing a strategy of systematic violence against civilians. The military's ongoing violence against civilians is an extension of their long practice four cuts counterinsurgency strategy. This has been used for decades against local populations in EAO areas, but is now being applied across the country, including in peri-urban and urban areas. The central objective of this strategy is to dislocate enemy forces from the civilian communities that support them. This is achieved through mass displacement campaigns that clear entire areas of people or those of target ethnicities. Those who refuse to leave their lands, homes, and property are treated as combatants and subjected to constant military operations to keep them in a state of disorganization, to cut off their food supplies, and to terrorize them into submission. However, such raids on villages are ineffective at killing PDF fighters. The SAC's clearance operations in remote townships are costly and ineffective at controlling territory for the long term. There are simply not enough SAC security forces to move around. The SAC's much vaunted offensives from September and October onwards in Western Myanmar, namely Sagaing, Magway, Chin, have produced little in the way of control or stability. The SAC is increasingly having to react to events driven by the resistance. Western Myanmar is central to resistant efforts against the SAC. Sagaing region has consistently experienced some of the highest numbers of conflict incidents in the country. Townships with high rates of conflict include Pale, Depien, Yinmarben, Budalin, Homelin, and Kenu. Others are Ayada, Myang, Kata, Kamblu, Penlabu, and Changmu. Kale and Monua townships are among the most active in the country. I don't expect listeners to be familiar with these townships. Even after 8 years in Myanmar, I certainly wasn't. But it is in these townships where the revolution will be determined. Overall, Chin State is a bellwether for determining whether resistance forces can seize and hold new territory, along with Kaya State. Magway and Sagaing are symbolic as Bamar Heartland regions that are leading resistance to the junta. Karen and Kachin states are also important fronts and play a significant role in the battle against the SAC. For several months, there has been a maturing of resistance forces whereby they have gained leadership and experience. The NUG has also further developed policies to guide the democratic resistance's war effort. A review of conflict incidents also highlights that while there is still a major gap in armaments between SAC forces and those of the resistance, the latter is arming itself relatively quickly to the point where self-defense groups are using mortars and underwater mines against SAC forces. Assessing the military's internal coherence is difficult, but it is undoubtedly under historic levels of stress. This is now a battle for SAC's sheer survival. It is apparent that the military has maxed out its reserve forces, meaning it is using all, or at least nearly all, the assets it has available. Military reinforcements routinely number in the low hundreds. For an institution facing an existential crisis, such low numbers say a lot for a military conventionally understood to have over 350,000 members. Moreover, townships that saw intense fighting early on between SAC forces and the KIA are no longer active as fighting moves further afield. Papun Township in Karen State is still exceptionally active, but the KNU has expanded operations in Maunbago and sometimes in Tananturi together with PDFs. Fighting is still heavy in Shan State's Muse Township, but since September, one of the ethnic armed groups has waged routine actions against SAC forces further south. Taken as a whole, absolutist arguments found in some early analyses that the military cannot be defeated are simplistic and fail to account for how significant the events of 2021 have been in Myanmar's history. No other year compares, not even 1988 in terms of social, political, and economic upheaval to 2021. While nothing is a given in what will happen next in Myanmar, the SAC no longer has the initiative and is on the back foot trying to quell resistance. Simply put, momentum is shifted against it as it regularly suffers battlefield losses. While it is nowhere certain that the SAC will lose, it is likewise not assured that it will win. To be clear, at best, what SAC can hope for in terms of winning is enough pacification of resistance to allow it to stabilize control over core areas of the country and hence nominally consolidate its power nationally. The threshold necessary for the consolidation of power nationally is murky at best, especially in the near term. In contrast, the terms of the SAC losing are increasingly more obvious as armed resistance entrenches itself across the country. Losing now implies the removal of the SAC from power. Months of excessive violence against protesters, thousands of arrests, and wide-scale military operations piled atop the COVID pandemic and a collapsing economy have done nothing to stem the expansion of armed resistance. Nationwide and not dependent on external support, resistance to military rule is now self-sustaining. This is apparent to the resistance, with a common refrain for protesters being, you can kill the revolutionary, you can't kill the revolution. Regardless, the SAC seems resolved on perpetuating even more atrocities. This will likely only deepen resistance further rather than diminish it. It now stands to reason that violence has crossed a threshold of scope and intensity whereby major actors on both sides feel the need to escalate fighting because a loss would mean death, displacement, or life imprisonment. A populace increasingly inured to state terror will only fight more. So this raises a simple question: what happens now? Myanmar is a country that is at war against one institution, the military. The form of this war is national uprising. This is not a binary civil war with a neutral population watching both sides. This is a national uprising of the population against the military. The strongest leverage the SAC has over the Myanmar people is its willingness to use extreme violence. This willingness to use violence is compounded by the inability of the international community to play a role in influencing the junta. That the SAC continues its violent approach means it accepts nothing else. This zero-sum game is recognized by the vast bulk of the population that now views armed resistance as an unfortunate necessity that needs to be seen through. Put another way, there's a critical mass in the Myanmar public that feels a base level of violence is needed to finally be rid of military dictatorship. Definitive to how events unfold is which side can persevere longer, as violence undoubtedly will get worse before the situation gets better. The military is not designed to counter a national uprising across multiple fronts. Core tenets of the SAC's military strategy, as well as visible metrics for military successes in the past, were slowly lacking in 2021. Most notably, the SAC failed to secure new ceasefires with EAOs waging war on it. It is unclear which EAOs, if any, would agree to new bilateral ceasefires anytime soon when the military is pressed across the country. At the start of 2022, the SEC faces a stark reality as Myanmar's national uprising escalates. It acts like a foreign occupying force desperately trying to quell an uprising that is only burning bigger day after day. This is not a stalemate situation. It is not Western Europe in 1917. It is a conflict that is still nascent and highly fluid. PDFs are arming up. Conflict spans key states and is now entrenched in Bamar heartland regions, plus the major cities of Yangon and Mandalay. I'll briefly discuss the economic situation in Myanmar before concluding. Prior to the coup, I was working on economic reforms for the elected national government. We undertook a methodical cataloging of economic reforms in the form of a stocktake that identified over 140 major economic reforms over the decade of transition, i.e., from 2011 to 2020. These major reforms were composed of hundreds of individual reform actions. Over a decade, Myanmar had developed a steady trajectory of positive economic reforms. Myanmar's transition starting in 2011 was essentially one of normalization, requiring extensive state building and reintegration into the global economy. The economy has suffered massively since the coup. This is well documented. What is more interesting to consider now is how viable are flagship reforms from the transition period, like the telecom, central bank, and financial institutions laws, when the country is run by a barbaric junta. They aren't. The economic prospects for Myanmar under a junta are dismal because the nature of the reforms of the previous decade towards liberalization and diversified international engagement aren't viable when the country is a military dictatorship and hence an international pariah state. Moreover, although there was significant reform between 2000 to 2021, there were also major sectors that saw very limited reform. For example, land. Banking also still had a long way to go even before the coup. Extractives were also deeply problematic. Energy as a sector was uninspired. The same problem stymied some of the most important reform prospects. the military and its presence and control of key parts of government and the economy. The military's response to internal rebellion and global condemnation will be to regress the economy to sectors it can control, like agriculture and extractives, and focus on a limited number of trading partners, such as China. Monetary policy is again problematic, selling the dollars to bolster the chat, and it looks like the junta will start printing currency anew, likely causing inflation. The junta has created a Ministry of Industry and Cooperatives, so it looks like they are set to reemphasize state-owned enterprises and state intervention and industry. The junta has given carte blanche to proxies to exploit the country's natural resources. International businesses continue to disassociate from the regime. I could go on, but you get the point. The coup ended a decade of steady economic reform. The junta's naive expectations that they could just continue as is were painfully myopic. The success of earlier reforms were determined by their wider context, a country going through historic changes for the better rather than regressing into a brutal military dictatorship. My last point is the conflict has reached a point where it is the main driver of change in the country. Everything else, like the economy, must be understood in relation to how the armed conflict progresses. In conclusion, 2021 has had massive ramifications for Myanmar. We don't know for sure what will happen, but things are not going back to the way they were before 2010. Things are not going back to 2020 either. The public does not want a military-dominated transition, so-called transition again. They want a new country free of a toxic military that has destroyed generations of lives. Again, let me say thank you to ISEAS for hosting me today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matthew, for bringing us through a more granular description of what's happening on the ground, or what has been happening on the ground in Myanmar over the past year, and what this portends for the year going ahead, and all the I think the uncertainties and the very bleak situation, particularly with regard to the economy and practically the destruction, the dismantling of those significant strides made in economic reforms over the past decade, and of course also highlighting how the coup can only result in much more limited interaction with external interlocutors regarding the economy, and which of these sectors will be more or most affected by what's happening in Myanmar after the 1st of February 2021. We have about 25 minutes or so for questions and answers, and the questions have been coming in. I'd like to group them together in terms of the topic or the interest that people have, and there are quite a few questions related to the visit by Cambodia's Prime Minister, Mr. Hun Sen, which is taking place today and tomorrow to Naypyidaw. And let me just read out these questions for the two panelists to consider and address for the first round. My colleague from ISEAS, Dr. Tumsak Chalampalanupap, would like to know, specifically from Dr. Min Zin, what are the public expectations from Prime Minister Hun Sen's visit to Myanmar, whether there is any new hope of a peaceful breakthrough? And similarly, there is a question from Daryl Lim, who also wants to know, with Cambodia as ASEAN chair, how will they approach the Myanmar issue, whether there will be any major breakthrough? How will ASEAN deal with the Myanmar issue should violence continue or escalate? And there is also a question from Milton Sao, who presents this question to the panel, that some people feel Cambodia Prime Minister Hun Sen's trip to Myanmar might undo ASEAN's efforts in banning military regime from the Southeast Asian bloc. And Milton wants to know the panel's views on this. Milton is from Channel News Asia. And from the Vietnam News Agency, Nguyen Tho Vu wants Dr. Min Zin's specific views about whether Prime Minister Hun Sen's personal way of approaching the Myanmar crisis will change the current approach of ASEAN's 5-point consensus. So over to both of the speakers, Go Min Zin, Matthew, your views and thoughts on the approach that Prime Minister Hun Sen of Cambodia is taking with regard to ASEAN's response to the Myanmar crisis. Perhaps I shall give the microphone to Go Min Zin first, then Matthew.
Thank you. Thank you for all these questions. I just don't want to speculate too much, but I think the Cambodia Prime Minister visit is quite crucial for many reasons. First and foremost, I think the majority of Myanmar people are very skeptical in the social media. We are very much against, even because I don't want to use social media as a measure, as an indicator to claim the representation. But we can fairly say that majority of the populations are quite skeptical. They don't want the ASEAN chair to be co-opted by the military. They are very worried. ASEAN is giving a zit to the military, not to the country's crisis. So that's quite important thing we need to be reminded, when we talk about mediation, because both sides prefer partisan mediation rather than trying to address the underlying, the nature of the conflict is always spiral, so it's important to make sure to get, consultation and somewhat, understanding with the different stakeholders. I would strongly encourage Cambodia to reach out to the opposition NUG and ethnic armed groups, to get what the people of Myanmar are concerned with this new ASEAN chairman approach to Myanmar crisis. Otherwise, without having that broad consultation and then understanding, I think it will be like alleged as a co-optation, and even like very cynical kind of like view in Myanmar, which is Cambodia, China, and Myanmar work together to undermine Myanmar's people's aspiration for democracy and federal union. So that's a very important thing. But I think at the same time, it's important for ASEAN chair to work with the UN Special Envoy and Japan Special Envoy and then Chinese Special Envoy, and all these different key stakeholders need to be coordinated. Otherwise, it will be like the Myanmar military can easily play a usual game, which is divide and conquer. To give more favor or some kind of kudo, like to the Cambodia, and by ditching UN Special Envoy and United States, upcoming coordinator. So I think like on the Cambodia front, it's quite important to pay attention to coordination and listening, rather than trying to show off, with the solo diplomatic championship. So otherwise, that will be unsuccessful, or at best and at worst be seen as a co-opted. For me, I want to stop this. Yeah.
Thank you, Go Min Zin. Matthew, your views?
I would think. I mean, for me, my perspective would be that the key audience in all of this is the Myanmar public, and unfortunately, the international community has burned near all its bridges with that public since the coup, because it's been so spectacularly ineffective. And it's very hard to recover from that. I don't think Hun Sen is going to do anything to bolster the belief amongst the Myanmar public that ASEAN is going to be able to do meaningful actions to resolve the situation. I think the other reality here is that the military situation is now determining what unfolds, and the international community can make all the calls they want for ceasefires, but it's a bit of escapism. It doesn't connect with reality. There's a military conflict unfolding, and neither side has reached any kind of reflection points that would make them want to engage and kind of in any meaningful kind of dialogue. I think that's also very problematic because the actors like ASEAN haven't talked to the NUG. So again, all of these dynamics are not pushing the public to support international engagement, primarily because that international engagement hasn't been meaningful. And I don't think people have any expectations that Hun Sen is going to change that. If anything, he'll probably do the types of actions that lend some kind of pretense to the junta that it wants to engage in some kind of peace negotiations, but it's just a meaningless facade. So I mean, I hope that we'll follow the recent remarks of the Indonesian president that unless the junta actually makes significant steps, I mean, even the most minimal steps would be a starting point towards the 5-point consensus. But other than that, I hope that ASEAN does not allow political representation at these ASEAN events. Thank you.
Thank you. I think building on that, I mean, the observations that both of you have given about the situation also very much being scoped by the military, I think the second round of questions will focus on this. We'll try to push this a bit further. So from Murray Hebert from CSIS in Washington, this question is specifically directed to Dr. Min Jin, but Matthew, you can chime in too. Do you think the military is becoming disillusioned by their leaders' inability to achieve their goals for returning the country to some level of stability? More broadly to the panel, Romain Gaillot, ISEAS Associate Fellow in the Myanmar Studies Program, would like to know about the key actors of the coup, their political, economic, and other incentives to carry out the coup, and what does our knowledge of these insights tell us about a possible way out of the crisis? Then Victor Mills from the Singapore International Chamber for Commerce and Industry would like to know about whether there are any grounds for optimism that civilian rule might return in the next 5 years, and related to that, what do you see as the key tipping points which will change the military's grip on land ownership and other assets, as well as all political levers? So there's that set of 3 questions that deal with the military and seeking your insights. Perhaps, again, Goh Min Jin, since you have a question specifically directed to you, you could start off first, and then the other 2 points, I think, are more relevant to Matthew's observations.
Thank you. I think that military did not expect, they already admitted that they did not expect this scale and this widespread massive resistance from the population. They in the beginning, their coup intention was to revise their veto power, right? They felt that they could not defeat Aung San Suu Kyi, because even though they set up the 2008 constitution that enshrined the military prerogative and military privileges, even then they could not win over Aung San Suu Kyi's popularity and victory in the 2 previous elections. So they just wanted to revise the constitution, their veto power with this, the constitution and veto power with this new set of, the PR system in election and all these things. So they tried to portray the coup as mainly palace coups to, between the military and the corrupt, so and so corrupt, the NLD, that's, with the electoral fraud. But later on, the whole, the trajectories of the resistance have shifted, from the, NLD and restored to the, the 2020 election outcome to more broader, we want a new nation, type of, very radical, vision. And that's very interesting. And that make military and getting more and more in siege mentality, so military in my understanding, they have that attitude that we military even managed to weather in 1948 when the country, was fallen into the insurgency hand. Even the outskirts of Yangon was controlled by the Karen rebel. Why not now? That's what their mentality. We military managed to, recover, bounce back from 1988 when we only had like a few months of the foreign reserve money. Our military capacity was very weak. Now we have submarines, 2 or 3 submarines. Why not now? So that's what their mentality. That's what the maybe like top level guys. But the people on the ground, the soldiers who also suffer from the poverty and then repression like other civilians. I think we are now seeing more and more defection, on the ground. So I think that the military, I don't think they are reaching to the level of dissolution, but they realize this is a very tough battle they have to fight for. And then I think they will do it. They have a capacity to kill people, and they have a political will to continue killing people. So I think like it's Burmese military, now when we try to understand, even though they're in the siege mentality, it's not for them to give up. They're likely to double down, but not necessarily with the current leadership. We can probably see leadership reshuffle within the military by scapegoating each other, but it doesn't mean military will be willing to give up, their privileges and then their status quo unless they feel they're in the position of strength. When they're in the position of strength, I think they will be more comfortable talking to the opposition and challengers. Meanwhile, I think they will definitely double down with their thing with a few occasional concession and diversion and try to go up their opponents, but fundamentally they will double down to gain the control again.
Matthew?
Yeah, I think for me on the second and third questions, I think the incentives for the coup, I agree with Min Zen. There was this kind of ongoing narrative that, they had wanted the transition to pan out in a certain way, and it wasn't. And this was meant as like a corrective to that, and it didn't quite work out for them. I think now the challenge is that the coup and the current bloc has been so wrapped around Min Aung Hlaing himself, and it'll be very hard for him to compromise. Also because it's also tied into the Rohingya genocide and the ICC, and that has significant implications for the calculus. I think from a military perspective, I look a lot at the military. I call it the tactical ground game. Personally, I'm not convinced that the military has a viable strategy to succeed. They are not designed to quell a national uprising. And the officer corps certainly has a lot of resolve and cohesion, coherence. But what they have right now is they have an uprising across their whole country, and they have endless numbers of small units spread here, there, and everywhere. They can't sustain this, and you'll start to get to a point where they don't have enough recruitment, they can't send reinforcements, they can't resupply, they don't have enough helicopters. I spent a year in Afghanistan with the US military, we had endless air assets to move stuff around, and it still wasn't always enough. The military in Myanmar has nothing comparable. All of this is going to hit a point where these, what Min Sen said, the lower ranks who are bearing the brunt are going to start reaching a breaking point. That's also compounded through the constant IED attacks. These are utterly debilitating to morale. They're also incredibly effective at killing soldiers. And for me, I think this is a really important story that we don't focus on enough, which is what is life like for your average small unit of the Myanmar military right now. And it's horrible. And it's really going to be horrible once the rainy season starts and units that have been fighting continuously for months aren't reinforced, aren't sent anywhere to recuperate, and don't have adequate supplies. And it's obvious that the entire population hates them. So I think for me, the reality of I'm not convinced that, like I said, we don't know what's going to happen. The SAC could prevail, but I'm personally, I think there's also a possibility that the SAC could collapse. And I think that's just a reality of the military situation. And they've started a ball rolling that they can't stop. I mean, by my calculations, the busiest days of attacks on the military were the first parts of this week. That's only going to increase. And I have not met anybody who can give me a credible argument about how the SAC can maintain this war effort. Just for the last point, on the return to civilian rule, I think we can't underestimate this idea that the ASEAN wants to go back to 2020. The Myanmar public doesn't. They don't want another transition. This transition was bunk. That's obvious to people. They don't trust the military. They're also aware. Look at Sudan. How many times do we have to go through the same cycle of compromising with the military, and then the military just stages another coup? Like we've already crossed this threshold where they don't accept a barbaric military that murders them, and they're not going to agree to a political compromise that just enshrines the military to keep the country hostage in perpetuity.
Thank you. I'm going to squeeze in 2 more rounds of questions. And the next round deals with a big neighbor to the north, China. Aung Thun, ISEAS Associate Fellow in the Myanmar Studies Program, would like to know, and this question is directed to Dr. Min Sen, whether there is any potential that China can say something decisive soon towards a pathway to this crisis. And Luke Tay also shares a similar question. Beyond ASEAN and China, what influence or agenda may other presumably significant players have towards the conflict? And he has listed the US, India, Russia, Japan, and so on. So I'd like to ask both of you to address these 2 questions compositely, concisely, and then I want to squeeze in a last round that will deal with the economic outlook and business implications. So Go Min Sen quickly, and then Matthew.
We all know China plays significant role, especially Chinese leverage over not only the Myanmar military, but also the ethnic armed groups along the north, and also economic leverage. When you look at the investment in March, April, May, the energy investment from China is like, I think, about $2 billion US. So it's this quite huge, like the investment and also trade with China, mainly because of COVID. It declined, but it is likely to resume. So I think China play an important role, but at the same time, China is more and more sensitive to the reputation. They don't want to be, labeled as a supporters of brutal military in Myanmar. So that's why they're trying to mitigate and also involve at the same time mitigate international intervention in Myanmar. So I think for China, they will be quite careful. They don't want, like failing of institution or that lead to to the spillover effect in China. They want to prevent that, but at the same time, they'll be quite wary. The Western international, especially Western, pressures on Myanmar will not lead to acceptable for Chinese solution rather than more radical change in Myanmar. That's what I think. Not only China, I think, but also other neighboring countries are quite wary of this radical change in Myanmar. But the Myanmar populations are very much aspire to achieve this radical new nation building vision for this country. So that's a balance that we have to strike in 2022 and beyond.
Matthew, quick response?
I would just add, I don't disagree with anything Min Zin said. I would just add, I guess my overarching point would be, I think Myanmar is at a state that a lot of what's going to happen there is determined by domestic factors. And I think that's unfortunate because the international community has squandered so much of the opportunities early on to play a stronger role. But the armed conflict has escalated to the point where even major actors are going to have a hard time trying to shape what happens.
Right. I think that gives me a good segue into this round of questions that relate to the economic outlook. Mr. Ong Keng Yong, former ASEAN Secretary General, wants to ask Matthew for more details on the economic outlook for Myanmar. Are Western sanctions biting, and are the Chinese and Japanese investments frozen? And what about border trade with India and Thailand? And a related question from Robert Fox for Dr. Min Zin is, what are one or two effective measures which regional businesses can take? For example, publicly enforcing arms embargo by outing participants. So that's the economy round. Matthew, over to you first.
I must confess, I can't rattle off a lot of statistics about the most recent economic data. The overall trajectory has certainly been a dire one. I don't see that changing in 2022. I think perhaps there will be some recovery from the COVID pandemic. I'm not sure it's going to be particularly significant. I think the reality is that the armed conflict is escalating to the point where, like I said, it's starting to shape everything else that happens. And that includes the economy. We see this, for instance, on the major highway that crosses into Thailand. Also, one of the most conflict-affected areas in the country since the coup is the township that is the primary connection with China. So all of this is escalating, and it does have ramifications. I think overall, the scariest thing about 2022 in terms of the economy is that it's going to be incredibly painful for normal people. And the humanitarian situation is going to get worse and worse and worse. And we're going to see very significant food security issues. So I think I honestly don't have much optimism for the economy in 2022. And the junta has some very smooth talkers like Ong Neng who can try and sell stuff, but I think it's a lot of hot air. And that's just the reality that they've reverted the country to a barbaric dictatorship, and engaging with that a barbaric junta isn't palatable to most of the world, and certainly a lot of businesses will struggle to justify relations, especially if they involve the junta directly. So I would just end by saying I think the most important thing that we should we should consider in terms of the economy is the ramifications on normal people and what can be done to mitigate some of the humanitarian suffering.
Thank you, Matthew. That's a very sobering assessment. Goh Min Sin, your quick take on the one or two effective measures for regional business?
I think in terms of trades and, mainly because of COVID, there are a few decrease in trade between Thailand and Myanmar, Singapore and Myanmar, but even with India and Myanmar has increased. In China, 10 billion in less fiscal years, now 8.2 billion. So a few, drop. So I think that they will manage to maintain. We need to also consider the important roles of Russia, not only in the military equipment, but also in terms of energy supply. I mean, Russia is trying to export the oil and gas to Myanmar. So that's also quite important, thing we need to pay attention to. And what we can do as the regional business people, I think definitely we must stop doing business with the military conglomerates. We must stop doing business. It's not always easy to identify, the military involvement in businesses. But some of these major investment, major industries, you can target that the military own or military link. So we need to really target. I think it's important to identify the targeted pressure that can hurt the military, that can deny the legitimacy of the military. At the same time, we need to make sure we need to exploit our leverages. If we have public grievances, public resistance, international outcry, but we need to also exploit this leverages. This is what we call diplomacy. Unless we combine diplomacy and pressure, I don't think this situation will take us to the acceptable resolution that will serve the interests of Myanmar people. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I've really pushed the envelope for the time that we have for the Myanmar session. The outlook is grim. I'd like both of you to just give me your very quick 5-minute assessment, 5-second assessments of for this question from Chairman of the Singapore Institute of International Affairs, Simon Tay, who wants to know what is the key thing that could happen in the coming 6 months for de-escalation, and that would be your wrap-up for this session. Quickly, Matthew first, then Goh Min Sin.
Honestly, I think there will be escalation. If SAC starts to lose territory, it will perhaps be willing to start some kind of negotiation, but I don't see it before then.
Goh Min Sin?
I think we are now talking much more loudly about the humanitarian corridor and what types of humanitarian engagement we can use in vis-a-vis the Myanmar government, Myanmar SAC, as well as the challenges. I think it's quite important to explore any possible entry points that can help the civilian protection as well as humanitarian access. And then we have to make sure the neighboring countries need to be coordinated. If all neighboring countries can be coordinated on two things, civilian protection and then humanitarian access, I think that both the military and as well as its challenges will at least reach temporary or localized or issue-driven ceasefire. Then from that on, we can start talking about how to create the military extrication, federation, all these things along the process. I mean, with the more optimistic take, sure.
Well, thank you both for honestly, candidly sharing your insights. To start off the day's discussions with the situation in Myanmar is always, I think, grim and sobering, but there are, I think, these pockets for some optimism as the very real determination on the ground is showing and reflecting since February last year. My apologies to my ISEAS colleagues for eating into the time of the next session. We could go on forever, but I think we need to stop here, at least for discussing Myanmar. Thank you once again to our two eminent panelists, and thank you, dear audience, for all the questions. My apologies that we could not address all of them, but we will continue to have these discussions on different platforms. Over and out for the Myanmar session.